Imagine an arena echoing with screams not of warriors clashing in honorable combat, but of men torn apart slowly and deliberately while thousands cheered. Not in chaos, not in war, but as entertainment sanctioned by the most powerful empire on earth. The Colosseum is often remembered for gladiators and grand spectacle, but beneath that polished image lie stories Rome tried to bury, stories so brutal, even the emperors feared their legacy. These were not battles fought for glory. These were orchestrated nightmares meant to break prisoners, slaves, and anyone Rome considered expendable. There were events where men were forced to reenact myths only to actually die in the performance, torn by beasts or burned alive before roaring crowds. Sometimes the victims were criminals guilty of theft or rebellion. Other times they were simply prisoners of war or scapegoats for political drama. Some accounts speak of entire executions staged as theatrical plays with real blood, real terror, and no rehearsal. And while Romans convinced themselves this was justice or divine will, many citizens wrote secretly of their shame and disgust. Historians have uncovered letters, diaries, and etched graffiti that reveal shock at the excesses allowed in the name of spectacle. What kind of empire applauded the slow dismemberment of captives? What kind of crowd found joy in watching a condemned man sewn inside animal skins and hunted like prey? There were children in those arenas, elders, rebels, and innocents alike, their deaths, forgotten or misrepresented as legends. Yet whispers of these torments survived, carried through historians like Seneca and Cassius Dio, who hinted at horrors the state preferred hidden. This is the story of the arena spectacles Rome came to regret, the punishments that went too far, even for an empire built on conquest. The forgotten tortures are not myths, they are documented shadows, and today we uncover them step by step. To understand how these atrocities became public entertainment, we have to return to Rome's rise and the values that shaped its spectacles. The arena was not born from cruelty alone, but from politics, fear, and control. In the late Republic and early Empire, the games were tools used by emperors and elites to win favor among citizens. Bread and circuses, that was the promise: keep the masses fed and entertained, and they will not rebel. Gladiators at first were enslaved fighters or prisoners of war trained to kill for sport. But as crowds demanded novelty, the games evolved from duels to orchestrated executions. Romans called one of the most disturbing forms damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. It began as punishment reserved for serious criminals, but its definition expanded over time. Christians, rebels, and foreigners all found themselves thrown to lions, leopards, and bears. But these deaths were not always quick or random. The spectacle planners, known as editors, designed elaborate scenes complete with props, costumes, and scripts. Some victims were tied to stakes. Others were dressed as mythological characters so their deaths would blend with performances. In the reign of emperors like Nero, Commodus, and Domitian, the cruelty escalated. Nero was known for staging executions as theatrical punishments. He forced condemned men to play roles in reenactments of myths such as Orpheus, only to have them mauled by hidden beasts. Domitian reportedly held night hunts where prisoners were burned to illuminate the arena, while animals were released among them. Commodus himself boasted of killing animals and sometimes helpless men in mock battles. The Colosseum was not the only arena. Amphitheaters across the empire from North Africa to Gaul hosted variations of these events. Local governors copied Rome to prove loyalty and strength. These games were not cheap. Exotic animals were imported in great numbers: elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, and crocodiles. The logistics alone show intent and planning, not spontaneous violence. And yet, while elites saw this as politics and entertainment, many philosophers and writers questioned the morality behind it. Cicero expressed unease at the sight of criminals killed not for justice but amusement. Seneca wrote of a day at the arena where executions left him sickened. Pliny and Juvenal hinted that Rome's soul was eroding from within. The public, however, was divided. Some citizens admired the power on display. Others attended simply because it was normal. Few dared to speak aloud against it. After all, silence was safer in an empire where criticism could be fatal. Among the most disturbing spectacles were those that blurred the line between theater and execution. One infamous case was recorded during Nero's reign when condemned men were forced to perform the myth of Icarus. They were strapped into crude wings and thrown from high platforms while the crowd laughed as their bodies shattered on impact. Another horror was the reenactment of the myth of Dirce. In those performances, women were tied to wild bulls dragged across the arena until limbs tore or skulls crushed. These deaths were staged not for punishment but dramatic effect. Cassius Dio describes a spectacle where prisoners were dressed as Attis, a follower of Cybele, and were mutilated to imitate his mythic castration. Some victims were still alive when animals were unleashed to finish the act. Damnatio ad bestias itself could take many forms. Victims might be tied to stakes smeared with blood and left for lions. Others were sewn into animal hides so hunting dogs would mistake them for prey. Sometimes the condemned were placed on platforms rigged to collapse, plunging them into dens of beasts. There were also executions by fire. Prisoners were set ablaze using pitch-covered tunics. These were called tunica molesta. Reports from the time mentioned crowds cheering as men ran in flames, lighting up night games. Emperor Domitian was rumored to hold events where prisoners were burned to serve as torches while he dined. There were mass executions, too. After revolts, especially in the provinces, hundreds of captives were marched into arenas and divided among animals, soldiers, or machines. Some were forced to fight unarmed against gladiators armed with real weapons. Others were used to test new weapons such as ballistae and catapults, launching bodies into the air. Commodus took cruelty further by entering the arena himself. He would stage hunts where tied men were posed as animals and he would spear them from a balcony. He once decapitated an ostrich and waved its bloody head at senators as a warning that their safety was an illusion. There were more covert forms of torture within the arena walls. Some arenas had underground cages where victims were held for days without food, then released to face animals at their weakest point. Others were subjected to mock trials in public where the verdict was predetermined and the execution immediate. In some regions, criminals were forced to fight each other to exhaustion, while beasts waited nearby for survivors. The horror grew so great that even Rome's allies began to question its image. Envoys from eastern kingdoms reportedly expressed shock and dismay after attending certain games. The empire's leaders, however, rarely acknowledged any wrongdoing. Only hints survive in letters and official decrees that tried to limit excess without banning the games. Behind every spectacle, there was a person with a story erased by blood and sand. Think of a prisoner of war captured far from home, brought to Rome in chains, forced to die for the amusement of strangers. Some were fathers, mothers, or teenagers caught in the wrong rebellion or sold by desperate families. For many victims, the anguish began long before the arena. They were paraded through streets, mocked, beaten, and caged. Some begged for a quick death, knowing the alternative was torture before thousands. Prisoners wrote messages on walls, prayers, curses, or fragments of names. A few accounts mention mothers clutching children as guards dragged them into holding cells. The roar of the crowd above reminded them no mercy would follow. For spectators, the emotional impact varied. Some citizens reportedly wept or turned away when a victim screamed. Letters from the philosopher Seneca describe his horror at hearing bones break and organs spill while the crowd cheered. He wrote that the arena made beasts out of men, and that even the spectators were prisoners of Rome's hunger for blood. There are accounts of children in the stands watching bodies torn apart for their first time. Some historians suggest that trauma passed silently through generations. The arena was a place where empathy died for many who watched and suffered. Even slaves tasked with cleaning the arena, after events, bore the burden of what they witnessed. They scraped blood from sand-gathered remains and restored the scene for the next day's horror. Some later told stories secondhand of victims who whispered for their families before dying. The emotional scars extended into the political elite as well. Emperors who presided over the bloodshed often became paranoid or unstable. Nero's obsession with performance led him to destroy those who reminded him of his ruthlessness. Commodus believed himself a living god and descended into madness. The arena reflected Rome's fear of losing control. The louder the crowd, the quieter the dissent. Some citizens began to avoid the games not out of protest but self-preservation. They could not stomach what they saw, yet dared not speak. As Christianity spread, some converts condemned the arena as a place of evil. Stories of martyrs torn by lions became symbols of oppression and cruelty. These narratives inspired early movements against the games, though the suffering continued for centuries. To imagine the emotional impact fully, we must picture the silence after the crowds left. The wind blowing over stained sand, the cries of animals still caged, and the echoes of death lingering in. Stone corridors. For Rome's victims, their last moments were not glorious, but forgotten until now. The forgotten arena tortures of Rome were not accidents of history, they were choices, made in the name of power, control, and spectacle. For centuries, the empire glorified strength, while hiding the shame of those it destroyed. Yet even in that era, voices of conscience emerged quietly, condemning the games that stripped humanity from both victim and spectator. In the end, Rome did not fall because of one battle or invader. but from the slow decay of values. When an empire finds pleasure in the suffering of the helpless, it carves its own epitaph in blood. The legacy of these torments forces us to ask who we become when cruelty is normalized and suffering becomes entertainment. Today, ruins of arenas still stand admired by tourists who rarely imagine the cries once trapped in those stones. The Colosseum is a symbol of Rome's grandeur, but also its darkest sins. Beneath its arches lies the memory of thousands whose names were never recorded, their death staged, then buried under applause. History teaches us that power without mercy is a weapon that turns inward. The Romans believed fear kept order, but fear also erodes the soul of a nation. Some emperors realized too late that the arena had become a mirror showing the empire's own brutality. As the centuries passed, the games dwindled not from sudden compassion but exhaustion, political change, and religious influence. What remains are fragments of testimony and the unspoken truth that even mighty Rome regretted what it allowed. Let these stories remind us that humanity is measured not by monuments or armies, but by how the weakest are treated. If we forget that lesson, history will repeat its darkest chapters in new forms. And if you want more untold stories hidden beneath the ruins of time, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, so we can keep uncovering the shadows history tried to erase.